like to introduce Mhairi McFarlane. Mhairi is the Director of Science and Stewardship for Ontario region of the Nature Conservancy of Canada. She oversees stewardship of the National Conservancy's properties throughout Ontario and landscape scale planning for property acquisition. She first joined the Conservancy in March 2008 and spent 6.5 years as a conservation biologist in the southwestern Ontario, where she designed, implemented, and managed field scale restoration of habitat in Norfolk County and on Pelee Island. She grew up in Scotland, holds an honors ecology degree from the University of Stirling and a PhD in ecology from the University of Exeter in Cornwall. Her thesis was on the behavioral ecology of Cape sugar birds in South Africa. After moving to Ontario in 2006 and a few short contracts with the Ministry of Natural Resources, she joined the Nature Conservancy of Canada. So welcome, Mhairi.
Good evening. Thanks so much for having me. I'm so sorry I couldn't be with you in person this evening. I've come down with a cold, which is not a whole lot of fun, and definitely didn't want to share that fun with all of you this evening. So bear with me as I hopefully get through this and stay as coherent as I can. I do apologize if it's not my shiniest, most sparkling of presentations, but I will do my best to keep you all engaged, and hopefully my voice holds out as well. So I'm just going to share my screen. Can I get a thumbs up or some indication you can see my slideshow?
You can see it just fine.
Okay, cool. Okay, so yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. I would like to start off as well by also acknowledging my status as a visitor. Essentially, almost everywhere I am, starting even back home in Scotland. I grew up exploring wild places from where people had been forcibly cleared to make way for sheep farming, and I saw firsthand the ecological impact of that almost 200 years later. And as a recent immigrant here to Canada, I continue to regard myself as a visitor both in time and place, and I strive to do my best to learn about the cultures and people that came before me and still surround me today, and to treat the lands and people with dignity and respect. I have a huge amount still to learn about the cultures that surround us today and in the past and into the future, and I think through some of the work that I do at the Nature Conservancy of Canada and also at home in my backyard is one mechanism that I think we can all share in learning a little bit more about our natural spaces and natural species that occur around us, and go some way towards understanding human cultures as well. So yeah, I'm going to touch on quite a lot of different items here, and I'll pull them all together, and hopefully there's a little bit of interest for all of you. I'm aware that many of you are likely much better experts than I at some of these topics, but hopefully pulling them together in this way will give you some new insights into how we operate. So I'm going to start off. Okay, hang on. Okay, here we go. I think my internet connection might be a little slow. So I'm going to start off kind of at a basic level and talk a little bit about pollinators. So as many of you know, plants make flowers in order to reproduce. It's really that simple. Flowers contain pollen, which needs to be moved to different flower before a seed can develop. There's various complexities depending on what kind of plant you are, but that's essentially the basics of what pollination actually is and means. And pollen can be moved around in lots of different ways. So pictures here show very light, fluffy pollen that gets carried around by wind or water. The bottom right photo is a photo I took a few years ago in Lake Superior, and it really looked like someone had poured a pot of paint into the lake, but this was actually pollen from the conifer trees that had just released pollen into the atmosphere. And the key thing is that that's the kind of pollen that makes many of us sneeze. That's the kind of stuff that is responsible for some pretty unpleasant seasonal allergies that many of us suffer from. And I'll come back and touch on this later. That's a key point a little bit later on. These type of plants, this type of pollen doesn't need animals to move it. However, other types of plants do need animals to move their pollen around. So small mammals, including bats, are important pollinators in some parts of the world, not necessarily here in Ontario, but elsewhere in the world, bats can be quite important pollinators. Our ruby-throated hummingbirds that we see here, we've probably said cheerio to them, most of them for the year now. They've migrated south for the most part, but they are likely involved in pollinating some of our plants. But one of the biggest groups of animals that pollinates plants is, of course, insects. And the group of insects that we hear about the most is bees, and in particular domesticated honeybees. And a key thing is that plants that require animals to pollinate them, they tend to make showy, smelly, spectacular flowers that are basically behave as a big attractant to pull animals in. They're like, over here, there's some kind of food resource for you, something that's going to smell good, or something that will smell in a way that will attract these animals in. And the key thing about this as well is that the pollen has evolved to be kind of fairly big, relatively heavy, and relatively sticky. They have little hooks that allow the pollen grains to kind of hook themselves onto your fur if you're a bee, or onto your feathers if you're a hummingbird, and things like that. And this kind of pollen isn't very good at floating around in the air. This is the kind of pollen that it doesn't tend to make you sneeze, because it's very hard to install it in your nose, essentially. Oops, I did not mean to press that. Sorry, I accidentally unshared my screen. Let me try that again. So these are the kind of plants that are really important to plant if we're interested in supporting wildlife and supporting pollinators. So here we go. So we've probably heard a lot in the media about bees. Insect pollinators are incredibly important for supporting wildlife. So not only are these animals really important for allowing plants to reproduce, but when plants reproduce, they produce seeds, they produce fruit, they produce nuts, things which are actually really important for other wildlife. So birds, mammals, including little tiny small mammals ranging right up to bears, are actually ultimately dependent on plants being successfully pollinated by, in many cases, animals. It's obviously also really important in our food industry. A lot of the food that we've all been eating today was most likely, at least somewhat in part, dependent on some kind of animal pollinator. And although a lot of our food is pollinated by domesticated honeybees, there is increasing understanding of the importance of wild native insects as well in pollinating a lot of our food crops. And that, of course, is worth a huge amount of money to the economy every single year. These numbers are a little bit out of date right now, but it's a lot of money that we're talking about that these little animals do for us, essentially for free. So they're pretty important directly for us. I've alluded to this already, but one thing that you will hear about is declines in honeybees. Managed honeybee colonies have suffered a lot of declines recently, particularly in North America, including here in Ontario. There's various diseases, there's mismatches in timing between when the bees are active and plants are flowering. But the key thing to bear in mind as a conservationist is that these are actually a non-native domestic animal. And although this is a huge problem for, to some extent, the food industry and obviously also the honey production industry, it's not necessarily directly a conservation problem in itself. But what is a conservation challenge in itself is the many, many native bees and other insects that are very important pollinators too, which are also declining rapidly. There's over 400 species of bees right here in Ontario, and many of these are declining to the extent that there are several species that are actually listed as endangered right here on our doorsteps, and some that are likely extirpated from quite large areas. So that's the thing that as a conservationist we're concerned about, but also as someone that eats food, then we should also be concerned about these declines of native animals as well. And I should also mention it's not actually just bees. I kind of love to bring this up because it can be a little horrifying for some people that other insects like blowflies are actually really important pollinators as well. And a really cool example that is relevant to southwestern Ontario is the pawpaw. This is a native small tree that produces large edible fruit, and it's actually pollinated by flies, which are attracted to the flowers, which actually smell like rotting meat. And I haven't tried this yet. I do have some pawpaws growing in my garden, but they're not quite big enough to be flowering yet. But I have heard that you can increase the chances of pollination by hanging, say, a roadkill squirrel or something in the branches of your pawpaw tree to help attract in these little blowfly pollinators. So I will check back with you in 5 or 10 years when my trees are big enough and see if that actually works. So just building on that, we've kind of talked a little bit about why we should care about insect declines, but there's other reasons as well beyond just our food. Widespread declines in insects are being documented all around the world right now, and they're closely linked with really steep declines in especially insectivorous birds, so birds that eat insects. And that's obviously a problem if you like to watch birds as well. So I'll talk about that a little bit further. But let's explore why some of these things might be declining a little bit. As usual, these things are never straightforward. There's many different factors that come into play. So widespread use of pesticides, climate change, good old-fashioned habitat loss are some key major drivers of insect declines and changes in timing and location of some of these really important insects. So like any other animal, insects need food, they need shelter, they need somewhere to lay their eggs, somewhere to spend the winter. Some insects spend the winter as an adult, some of them overwinter as eggs, some of them overwinter as larvae or pupae. But essentially they all need somewhere that they can spend overwinter and hatch out again in the following year. And these are things that we're seeing huge losses in as key elements of things that insects need at some point in their life history. I mentioned the link to birds already. Some key birds that are dependent in whole or in part on insects include barn swallows. These used to be a very common, everyday, almost kind of household name bird, if you like. Excuse me. These are actually now ranked as threatened in Ontario, so threatened with a risk of extinction here in Ontario, right in our doorsteps. Similarly, American kestrels, there are several birds of prey like the American kestrel that actually spend, or quite a large portion of their diet is actually insects of some sort. They will eat small mammals, potentially small birds occasionally as well, but they will also eat, some of these big beetles and grasshoppers and things that used to be much more abundant than they are now. And that's actually true for many other types of birds as well, that even if they're primarily eating, fruit or seeds at various points in their life history, then often they will use insects to rear their young for those first few days as they're building baby bird. Then one of the best ways to do that is to build it from insect food. So I mentioned habitat already, and I know this will not be an unusual concept for many of you, but just to pare it back down to basics for everyone's benefit, every living thing is essentially evolved to need a specific set of things, and that's what biologists and conservationists often reference as habitat. And some animals are quite happy in almost anywhere you like, and we reference them as generalists. So, for example, this is an American robin that built her nest in a traffic light here in London on my route that I used to cycle back when I went to the office. She was quite happy, apparently. She built her nest over a few days, she laid eggs. I never managed to check if she was successful or not, but I suspect she was. The city actually put up another set of lights so that the traffic wasn't being confused by her nest being in the way of the red light there, which I thought was really neat. But she's a really good example of a bird that we see almost anywhere we go, especially in southern Ontario. Other examples could be things like cardinals, raccoons, animals that we'll see in many different environments. However, other animals are much more fussy, and an interesting example might be the pileated woodpecker. If those of you live somewhere that backs onto a large forested area, you may be lucky to get these guys in your garden, but for the most part, they prefer kind of big tracts of reasonably old forest. And the point I'm trying to make here is that the same is actually very true of insects. Some can only eat one species of plant, or will only visit one type of flower. And without those plants, then that insect essentially doesn't have anywhere to live. And a famous example of that, of course, is the monarch butterfly. Monarch adult butterflies will drink nectar from almost any species of flower that happens to be flowering when they're active, but they can only lay their eggs on one group of plants, the milkweed plants. And without milkweeds, then they're unable to lay their eggs, or if they do lay their eggs, the caterpillars won't find anything to eat, and we won't have monarchs anymore. And the same is true for many, many other insect-plant relationships, some of which we probably don't even know about yet. There's probably still relationships that we don't yet know, haven't yet been described by science. And the other thing to bear in mind as well is that different animals, like our birds that are migratory or resident, they'll use different habitats at different points in the year. So some insects are active only in May, some are only active in July, some are only active in August, and not necessarily talking about pollinators here, but of course, think we're very familiar with the seasonal changes and things like black flies and mosquitoes. Some of these guys are pollinators, but some of them are not. But you get the point that there's some points in the year, including in the summer, where there's large numbers of these animals, other times there's not. So thinking about when plants are actually actively flowering and what is available as a food source for these animals is really important too. And just to kind of illustrate this with a pretty picture I took in London quite a few years ago, this is a protected area in London. And the labels themselves don't really matter, but the point is that the ground cover here was very, very diverse. There were lots of different types of plant, different colors of flower, different shapes of flower, different heights of plant, and different timings of flower. Some of the flowers were already open, some of them were already past, some of them were about to open a few days later. And the same is true for the forest. There's lots of different types of tree, different shapes of leaf, different textures of leaf. Presumably, I didn't taste them, but presumably slightly different flavors of leaf as well if you were a hungry caterpillar. So that'd be a really great place. If you're some kind of an insect that's looking for your favorite thing to munch on, then you're quite likely to find the right food source on that part of the forest. However, on the other side of the trail was this. This is a patch of lily of the valley, which is a non-native and can be locally quite invasive plant. It's a common garden plant. Many of us have it growing in our garden. When it flowers, the smell from the flowers is really quite intoxicating. I completely understand why many of us have it in our gardens. But the problem with this in this situation was that it had somehow gotten into this natural space and it had completely filled this patch of ground with only one plant. So you can see this one shape of leaf. There's no flowers right now, but that's also kind of the point, that it flowers briefly and then there's no food for pollinators for the rest of the year in that patch of ground. So if you're a pollinating insect looking for somewhere to something to munch on or somewhere to lay your eggs, then the chances of finding that on the right-hand photo are fairly remote, whereas the left-hand photo, you've got a pretty good chance of finding all of the things you need to complete your life history. And similarly, if you're a bird, if you're a wood thrush or a robin or something like that nesting in this patch of forest, then you're going to be much more likely to be able to raise your chicks in the photo on the left than in the right, because there's going to be so much more food for you to feed those hungry little chicks. I'm just going to mention quickly as well climate change. So I've focused a lot on habitat loss, but the other thing that we're of course facing is climate change. And one of the key factors that's relevant here to pollinators and to plants is the timing of a lot of these biological processes is kind of changing. Some processes are driven by day length, and of course that's not changing terribly much. But some processes and timings are in fact driven by temperature, or kind of relationship between temperature and day length. So in some cases, and we've probably all experienced this in the last few years, some things will actually come out and flower much earlier in the year if it happens to be really warm early in the spring. And that's fine, but if you're dependent on an insect pollinator that will only emerge when the day length is at a certain length, then you're not going to get pollinated. You're not going to make fruit, you're not going to make seeds. And so if that's a commercial crop, then the farmer's going to be really unhappy. And if it's a plant in the wild, then you're going to have a lot of unhappy wildlife. So these kind of mismatches in timing as a result of changes in temperature regimes can be really quite concerning and can have quite large cascading impacts on ecosystems all around us. And the other thing is that it can also exacerbate the spread of non-native invasive plants, like that lily of the valley I mentioned in the previous slides. Plants like that can often have an advantage if we have a super early spring or a really mild winter. Then sometimes plants like that can really take advantage of those changes and kind of expand to fill spaces that our native plants just can't manage to fill. So I'm going to change pace a little bit here. That was a little bit of doom and gloom. I'm sorry about that, but we'll start talking about some of the cool things that we can all do to kind of deal with some of these challenges that we're seeing and some of the great work that we're doing at the Nature Conservancy of Canada. So I'm just going to introduce Nature Conservancy of Canada briefly. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with us. For those of you that are not, we're Canada's largest land conservation charity. And we acquire through either purchase or donation land that provides significant habitat for wildlife is kind of the goal. And we're active right across the country from coast to coast. And we started in 1962, and since then we've helped conserve one way or another around 15 million hectares of land right across Canada. So that's not necessarily land that we've retained, that we hold ownership of, but this is including land that we've supported other conservation and Indigenous communities to conserve land and protect it for future generations and for wildlife and people. So this is just a quick map showing approximately the scale of our work. All of these little yellow dots is a project that we've helped secure. This map is a couple of years out of date now. It's really hard to keep up because we're such a busy, active organization, constantly working with people right across the country to conserve important land. And you can see right here in Ontario, there's a large number of projects that we've been busy, actively working on, including right up until today. To zoom in a little bit further in Ontario, this is a map showing areas where we try to focus our work. So these light green shaded areas are what we call natural areas. And I just wanted to point out a couple in particular. So this one up here in the Northern Ontario, the Great Northern Clay Belt around Hearst, this is a brand new natural area for NCC. I myself and a couple of colleagues wrote a quick plan for that last winter, and we're really excited to share that we've actually secured our first property in that area. You may have seen some of it in the media already. It's a huge chunk of boreal forest just southwest of Hearst, and we're really excited to be working with local communities there to work out how best to steward these lands moving forward. Another area that we're newly active in is the Central Ontario Corridors area. This is again another new natural area where we're also looking at securing several thousand hectares of land and have already achieved some of that. And again, working hard with communities and working out how we can be really filling the gaps for wildlife to move between existing protected areas such as Algonquin Provincial Park and through some of the other areas that we've been working in since the 60s and 70s with our start in Ontario. The numbers at the top, just to point out that Ontario is really big. I come from a little tiny place called Scotland, as we've already heard, and I always find it quite sobering to look at a map of Ontario, and this map doesn't even go right to the northern edge of Ontario and remind ourselves just how big this place is, which is why we have this fairly focused approach to developing really detailed conservation plans for these key areas, so that we can kind of break things down a little bit and really focus our effort. And it's not to say there isn't lots of important work that needs to happen in the places in between, just that we kind of need to start somewhere and provide a little bit of focus to our work. And I looked up some numbers just the other day, and right here in Ontario, with the inclusion of our recent big acquisitions in the Clay Belt area in the north, we've conserved around 244,000 hectares of land in Ontario. Some of those properties we've transferred to other partners that for whatever reason are better equipped to kind of take care of those lands. But we've retained ownership of almost 200,000 hectares, which we steward with our team of professional biologists. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the stewardship work that we do on our properties in the next few slides. So I've talked a bit about these rather depressing challenges that our little pollinating animals are facing and that our wild plants are facing. And unfortunately, we can't fix all of those things. We're only one organization. We can't kind of fix all of the problems in the world. But by addressing some of the key threats, we can really reduce the relative impacts of some of the other issues that we're maybe not able to tackle head on ourselves. So one of the key things that we do is when we acquire land, we take care of it forever. We have a team of professional biologists. We have some incredibly hardworking, dedicated volunteers. And via this kind of army of people, we've been doing a lot of habitat restoration work. Particularly in southern Ontario, we've restored around 1,000 hectares of former agricultural land. And I'll talk a little bit now about what that actually means. So up in the top left photo there, that's a former tobacco farm. This is a farm that we purchased actually just before I moved to Canada in 2006 or so. And we restored it by planting the seeds of somewhere around 100 native wildflowers, grasses, trees, shrubs, and vines. And over time, those plants have established, and that field is now providing habitat for a huge diversity of animals, including large numbers of pollinators, which I'll chat about later. So this is what this looks like. This is out on Peely Island. This is some restoration work that I was involved with when I was a conservation biologist out there. Again, we collect the seeds of wildflowers, and then that bucket on the left around my neck is a bucket of bur oak and red oak acorns that we then plant, hopefully out of sight and smell of the many turkeys that are on the island that would love to eat them up first. And then over time, these little guys germinate, and we do have some pretty decent success with little baby oak trees popping out of the ground, which I get a huge kick out every time I see that. I mentioned also we're incredibly grateful for large numbers of really dedicated volunteers that help us at public volunteer events. This is a very happy volunteer looking at his tray of native grasses that he's presumably about to help us plant, I think up in Rice Lake Plains. We don't just jam seeds in the ground, we also recreate habitat features. So this is an illustration of a wetland that we recreated on a former agricultural field. Many of our agricultural properties have been artificially drained in order to improve them for farming practices. And once we acquire the land and are ready to restore, one of the first things that we do is try to recreate some of that topography that's been lost. We will now often do an archaeological survey in consultation with a local Indigenous community so that we can better understand if these lands have been used and may contain important sites that are important to protect. And we've actually adjusted the way we've done restoration as we've learned a lot more about that, which has been really interesting for us. And again, so we'll plant wetland plants in these areas once we've done that work, and then wetland plants then pop out of the ground and wildlife shows up. It's quite extraordinary. We've been able to provide habitat for migratory shorebirds and ducks like this nice blue-winged teal almost right away. And we've actually had species at risk turtles and dragonflies and frogs and toads and things show up incredibly quickly as soon as we create these habitat features. So this was the former tobacco field that we purchased and restored just before I started with NCC, and this is what it looked like in that first summer after planting it. It looked pretty terrible. I think my colleagues at the time were very concerned that, oh, is this actually going to work? Is it just going to be a weedy mess? But almost immediately the following year, it looked fantastic. And just a few years later in 2013, it was a well-established kind of very young oak savanna habitat with patches of open sand, which is really important for some of our ground nesting bees, a good diversity of wildflowers and grasses, and as I mentioned, all these little oak trees popping up as well. And so this kind of restoration approach has been really pretty successful on the majority of the places that we've done it, and we've learned a lot as we've gone through this process. This particular site was studied. It was a field site for a lady that was doing her PhD on bees, and she actually managed to document somewhere in the region of 100 species of bee using this site just a couple of years after we'd restored it from a tobacco field. So that was really quite impressive to see that kind of return of biodiversity is possible really quite quickly. The next thing that we're doing, we're sort of refining our restoration approach a little bit by really trying to think harder about some of the specific species of insect that might benefit from specific plant species. So like I mentioned before, obviously monarchs are really dependent on milkweed plants. So we definitely plant as many different species of milkweeds as is appropriate for the site. But we're increasingly thinking about some other species. So the mottled dusky wing butterfly, it was successfully reintroduced to the Pinery Provincial Park just in the last summer or so. And we're hoping that we may be able to reintroduce that species to some properties and some NCC properties in the Norfolk County area, hopefully next year. And that's because we've been really strategic with the species that we've planted. We've planted New Jersey tea, we've planted lupin, specifically with a view to providing the right host plants to support that particular animal. So it's super exciting to have been basically reinstalling plants for quite a few years, and now we're looking at opportunities to reinstall animals, which is really cool. So that's kind of neat, but what's that got to do with you and I, you might be asking at this point. So when I started at NCC, I was really privileged to be involved with this kind of hands-on restoration work at scale, and it was incredibly rewarding to be part of that. But if, like me, you don't happen to have a 200-acre field to restore, then don't worry, you can still help contribute to this kind of restoration of habitat at scale if you're interested in so doing. So you've probably picked it up by now, but if you're selecting plants to plant, even in a pot on a balcony or in your garden or at the cottage, then I definitely recommend choosing native plants if at all possible. Our native pollinator suite of animals have evolved with the plants that were here, prior to European settlement, and those plants provide the correct nutritional value in their nectar. The pollen is just right for those animals. The chemical composition of the leaves in the plants is also just right for all of the animals that have evolved to eat them. So by providing that food for these insects, then we can actually start recreating chunks of ecosystem that we've lost over time. More diversity and more individual plants is obviously better than less, but anything that you're interested in doing is in its own small way going to contribute a little bit to making even just one or two happier pollinators or happier other insects in our kind of broader ecosystem. People often ask about cultivars or nativars. So these are plants that have been artificially bred for in order to promote some kind of feature. And there are native plants that have been kind of crossbred in order to either make them a bit better behaved or make them a certain color or certain shape of flower and things like that. And some of those are just fine and will still support at least some of our native animals, but some of them actually don't, it turns out. So when people ask that question, I always tend to recommend just do your best to get kind of the real deal, get the real wild type native plants if at all possible. So I have a few quick examples of what I consider to be some fairly well-behaved native plants that you could select for your garden. First of all, I will just mention that if you're lucky enough to have a property or a cottage or something that's already in a nice ecosystem dominated by cool plants like some of these, then you're already doing just fine. Enjoy what's already there. Use a field guide, use online apps like iNaturalist to identify and get to learn some of the things that are around you already. And depending on where you are, you may find that many of the plants around you are actually native anyway. And just doing what you can to kind of encourage and support them is probably the best that you can do. I hope it also goes without saying that I definitely would never encourage you to remove native plants from the wild. That can be incredibly damaging for ecosystems. It can pave the way for non-native plants to take hold in that gap or that soil disturbance that you've created, and essentially takes plants away from that ecosystem. So I'd encourage you to find a local native plant nursery and support them and purchase native plants from reputable sources like that. So just a few of my kind of top favorite plants for a garden setting. One of my favorites for a sunny, droughty area is prairie smoke. So the top right-hand photo is the kind of seed head, the top left is the flower head. This is such a cool little plant. It's really well behaved. It's very low growing. I purchased one back in 2008 and planted it in my garden right beside my driveway on the roadside. And I've essentially been not deliberately, it wasn't a choice, it's just kind of the way it happens, basically shoveling salty snow onto it every single winter ever since 2008 when I planted it. And every year it just gets bigger. Every year as the snow starts to melt, it's already flowering, it's already happy. It's like, hey, it's spring again. Thanks for all the horrible salty snow, no problem. So it's it seems, at least in my experience, to be a really robust plant for situations like that can be a little bit challenging to find something that actually looks good for a lot of the year. Another favorite of mine is butterfly weed, and I've included the scientific name here, not to kind of show off and be all fancy, but to make the point that when you're looking at plants in nurseries, then there's a lot of common names that are used that can be very confusing. There's a lot of plants that are called butterfly something or another, butterfly bush, butterfly weed, butterfly plant, butterfly who knows what. So it's worth looking for the scientific name and making sure that it actually is the native plant that will in fact support butterflies for their entire life cycle. The problem with some of the non-native so-called butterfly things is that they'll provide nectar for the butterflies to drink, but they won't necessarily be suitable for the butterfly to lay its eggs on. So you're only providing one part of what that animal needs with a non-native plant. And just to illustrate why I love butterfly weed so much, you can see how much care and attention I give to my lawn. This was a few summers ago. I do not water my lawn because I'm lazy and I don't care about grass. And I also didn't water my butterfly weed. And my butterfly weed did not care whatsoever. It was completely happy. It produced this lovely, luxuriant green growth. It produced these incredible orange flowers for weeks and weeks and weeks. I had monarch butterflies all over it, and it was totally happy dandy plant. So if you're erring on the side of being a lazy gardener like I am, or are conscious of your water footprint or however else you want to present it, then native plants, when carefully selected for the right place, are often a really, really good choice. If you have some more shady spots or kind of either deep shade or part shade, then there's some really cool native plants that are really great for those spots as well. One of my favorites for the woodland garden is the blue-stemmed goldenrod. Now, if you remember right back to, I think, the first and second slides where I talked a little bit about pollen and pollinators and things like that, this is an example of a plant that's much vilified for the wrong reasons. So it has a bright yellow flower, which has evolved to attract insect pollinators to come to it in order to pick up pollen and move that pollen to another plant. And that means that the pollen is generally quite heavy and sticky and is not going to make you sneeze. The thing that does make you sneeze is actually ragweed, which flowers at the same time as goldenrod, and is actually the culprit for many of our sneezings at that point in the year. Another favorite of mine for sun or shade is wild columbine. There's lots of different cultivars and non-native columbines, but this orange and yellow flowers is the native wild type that you'll see in nice forests throughout southern Ontario. And this is a great plant. It also attracts hummingbirds. So I get a real kick out of planting plants that birds will come to directly rather than indirectly, because they're eating the insects that the plant is supporting. So if you get a nice big patch of that growing somewhere, then keep an eye on it. When it's flowering, you may get some little hummingbird visitors as well. This is my patch of columbine from a few years ago, and this had several hummingbirds buzzing around it, which was really a real treat to see. And this is just to illustrate that you can actually jam really a ridiculous number of different species of native plant in a remarkably small area. So this is my front yard in London back when it used to be tidy. So I've made a kind of rain garden on the left, and the right-hand side is dry. So I've been able to jam a whole bunch of wetland plants in on the left, and much more drought-tolerant, sun-loving plants on the right. So you can actually support a huge diversity of different colors, different timing of flowering, different structures of flowers, and things like that. So I'm really trying hard to essentially maximize the food sources for different little beasties at different points in the growing season. And yeah, it's depending on what you like, there's almost certainly going to be something, if you're particularly into a certain color or a certain shape of flower or a certain shape of leaf, then I can almost guarantee you'll find it in some kind of a native plant to Ontario, because the diversity of plants here is really quite impressive. The other thing at this point in the year to remind you about, and there's a lot more about this in the media than when I first moved to Canada, but don't forget about winter. As people that live here in Canada, you're probably aware we have quite a lot of winter. And that's a really important time for animals overwintering. I mentioned before that our insect friends are overwintering either as sometimes as adult insects. Some butterflies actually spend the winter as adult butterflies, like our mourning cloaks, for example. Others will spend the winter as eggs or pupa or larvae. And they need somewhere safe to do that. So leaf litter can be really important for overwintering animals like that. So piles of leaves, piles of branches, twigs, things like that. If you have the opportunity to leave a kind of, messy part in your garden, then a lot of wildlife will really thank you for that. It provides cover, it provides food directly for animals. Migratory birds will really thank you. Both at this point in the year, some of our migratory sparrows are still kind of passing through. And when they come back in the spring, then if you've been able to leave some of that debris around, then those little guys will be really grateful for those sources of food. So yeah, I'm just about done, but I'm just going to touch on another angle that I think is really important for us to all think about, because it does really impact a lot of the animals that we all care about and love a lot. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about birds specifically. There's a lot of things going wrong with our bird populations right here on our doorstep, here in Ontario and beyond. So I'm just going to quickly touch on some things that actually kill birds annually in Canada. I've talked a lot about habitat, and that's a key thing that Nature Conservancy of Canada and yourselves can all contribute to reversing, is those losses in habitat. There's some other things that are still going on. These are some of the factors that as a land trust, we're not necessarily able to deal with head on, but we're hoping that our work will lessen the impact of some of these other threats. So these numbers are a little bit out of date now. There's a few other studies that have come out more recently with slightly different numbers, but ballpark still similar. Around 16 million birds are probably killed by wind turbines each year in Canada, which sounds like a big number, and it certainly is. But there are things that we can and could be doing about that. The other thing that is really impactful is birds flying into our windows of our houses. So this is a layout of birds that were killed by glass windows and glass railings and things like that, I think in Toronto a few years ago. And that's estimated to kill somewhere in the region of 22 million birds, so actually quite a lot more than wind turbines do. And I should say these numbers are based on actual science. These are people actually going out and picking up dead birds and quantifying it and analysing those data very carefully. So that's collisions with not necessarily just big skyscrapers, although that's an issue, but colliding with our own homes, our cottages, our swimming pool railings, things like that, all around us. But by far the worst thing that is killing birds in large numbers is actually these little guys. So cats that go outdoors are estimated to kill somewhere in the region of 200 million birds every single year in Canada. And that's kind of the middle of the estimate. I've seen kind of the lowest estimate I've seen is around 100 million, up to 3 or even 350 million birds are killed by outdoor cats every year. And that is, clearly a completely unsustainable number and makes those other factors really pale into insignificance. So I just want to put that out there just to give you some kind of food for thought as we're thinking about providing more habitat for wildlife. Then there's some key things that we can obviously do if we happen to be cat owners, or if we have glass windows or glass railings in particular. And there's some really straightforward solutions for these things. So I find myself with 4 cats. And we built a fun catio for them so they can kind of go outside, but they're still protected from all of the dangers of being an outdoor cat, and we're protecting the wildlife in our garden from the impact of these cats. You'll see just behind little dozer here in my kitchen window, there's these little white dots on the outside of the window. And this is a tape that you can put on to treat the outside of any glass windows that you can access, or glass railings as well. And that just makes the glass much more visible to birds, because what happens is they'll fly and they'll see the glass and they'll see reflections, but they won't see the glass itself as a barrier. So putting these little dots on the window means that the birds can suddenly see the glass and they can take evasive action instead of flying into it and injuring or killing themselves. The other thing that you can do if you're visiting a natural area, including a Nature Conservancy of Canada property, is to please do keep your dogs on leash. Dogs can be very disturbing to wildlife, including migratory birds, including arguably even to pollinators and plants. Dogs tearing around off trails can drag non-native invasive plants and seeds into areas that are very difficult for us to then treat. And it's just a bit nicer for other visitors if they're not having to deal with dogs kind of jumping up on you or running towards you. So yeah, just a few things that we can kind of all do in our everyday lives to kind of contribute to some of these, lessening some of these threats to all of our cool little creatures. I just want to finish with a couple of really cool examples of projects that we're working on right now or just about finished right now. We've actually just about finished a big wetland restoration project on Pelee Island in Lake Erie. I'd encourage you to come and visit next spring. We've restored about 62 acres of wetland, 25 hectares. This is approximately what it looks like around now. It used to be a field, an agricultural field, which we purchased. We've been renting it out to the farmer for a number of years. And now that we were able to raise the resources to restore it, we've created a series of open ponds and shallow, muddy areas for shorebirds. And we're also in the process of building some trails so that you can come in and access this without disturbing wildlife too much. And this is just an example of some of the detailed mapping and planning that goes into that kind of work, is really working out carefully what the topography looks like, where we can put wetlands without disturbing anything off property, without causing any flooding nearby and things like that. So it can be quite a detailed process, and it's really exciting that we have actually finally completed that project. And our next steps there are to really work on some visitor access facilities. So this is a photo my parents took from somewhere in Europe of a bird hide. So it's a little building that you can go into and sit relatively comfortably and watch birds and other animals from it without disturbing them, without getting your feet wet, and without completely freezing to death. So we're actually in the process of building one of these on Pelee on our wetlands. So next spring it should be finished and ready for you to visit if you're so inclined to come visit the island. You can have a look at the information on our website if you're interested in learning more, supporting projects like this. And with that, I will end, and I thank you very much for your attention. And again, sorry I couldn't be with you in person tonight, but I'd be excited to answer any questions that you may have in the last few minutes.
Thanks very much, Mhairi. You've certainly taken us on quite a journey there with, first of all, telling us about all the horrible things to come, and then breaking down how to protect nature ourselves. And so often when we hear from large organizations, we hear about what you're doing, but you've given us some really good tips on how to, in our own yards, help out. And I'll just tell our members that later this season, we will be having somebody from the Dusky Wing Restoration Project will be speaking. And we'll also have somebody talking about oak savannas. So you've set us up for future things. The other thing that you may not know that we do, but we have a plant sale and a native plant seed exchange every year. And most of the species that you mentioned, we have for sale, or we'll have a seed. So that's been great.
Amazing.
So I'm just going to remind people to put your questions in the chat. I'm not seeing anyone questions yet, but one of the questions I'll have you, and it's sort of timely, is will any of your properties be threatened by all the new proposed government regulations to encourage development? Is it possible your properties will be impacted by development? Would you be forced to give them up, or?
That's a good question. I'm pretty sure not. So we're a private landowner, like any other private landowner in some ways. So we purchase properties fee simple. So we're in many cases here in Ontario, especially, where we own that land outright. And we have various internal policies and agreements in place that demonstrate that those lands really are protected in perpetuity. I mean, my crystal ball is as murky as anyone else's, arguably, these days, but you know, our lands really are pretty solidly protected, and they're not actually provincial or national parks, but they're at the highest level of protection that we can manage as a private landowner. Yeah.
Marlene and Nina, we do have some people actually who came to the live event that you're not at, but they've been watching. Are there any questions from the ARB Center, Marlene or Nina? I'm not seeing any questions, which is unusual because usually our members have lots of questions.
Right. Maybe I bored everybody too much. Oh, I see a question in the chat, maybe.
Okay. Oh, yeah, here's a question. Do you want me to read it for you then? You mentioned about contiguous natural spaces. How do we do this with all the development that's coming?
Yeah, it's a good question. So at NCC, we have a fairly detailed conservation planning process. So I mentioned our kind of natural area scale plans, and that's these big landscape scale plans where we try to identify the most important places where we can do the most we can to conserve biodiversity. So we'll actually identify, you know, individual parcels of land that we think are of the highest priority for us to protect one way or another. And there's lots of different tools that we can use to protect land. And one of the things that we put into that planning process is trying to think about connectivity, so connecting pieces of land, and that's particularly important for some species. So further north in the boreal habitat, for example, then contiguous blocks of large chunks of undisturbed habitat is really important for woodland caribou, for example. They need big chunks of contiguous forest habitat, and that's certainly a key part of those plans that we make is that we aim to do that. And in southwestern Ontario, like a lot of our restoration work has, not all of us, but some of it has been quite focused on forest restoration. And in that case, we have a pretty detailed mapping process where we can work out how many hectares of contiguous forest can we create through restoration and land acquisition and protection. And we can work out, you know, how many hectares of interior forest habitat would we get over time. And we're really trying to link that back to the recovery strategies of particular species at risk. For example, prothonotary warblers and Acadian flycatchers are really good examples of real southwestern Ontario species at risk birds that need those big chunks of contiguous forest. So we're really thinking hard about the different species and what their needs are when we're setting out to protect and restore habitat. And certainly with the pace of some of the threats that I've talked about, and some of the things that you're mentioning, then the pace of some of those threats does feel like it's ramping up. And so the pace of our work also needs to ramp up, and we're trying hard to keep pace with that so that we can still strive towards conserving big chunks of habitat that's relevant to the species that we're hoping to not see disappear. Hopefully that answered the question to a degree, but it is difficult times, I'm not going to lie.
And the next question is the Conservancy involved at all in schoolyard naturalization?
Oh, great question. Not directly for the most part. We don't quite have the capacity to do that kind of work, really, unfortunately. But that being said, do feel free to reach out to me, and I can either give you some ideas or connect you with folks that are maybe more focused on that kind of work. There's a Facebook group called the Ontario Native Plant Gardening group, and there's a ton of resources and some really well-versed people in there. I'm in it as well, but there's a lot of really good advice in there about specific naturalization projects. So that might be a good place to start. But feel free to drop me an email, and I can see if I can help. But it's a really good thing to have happen. It's just something we don't quite have the capacity to do all the things like that that we really wish we could. But it's always very exciting for me to hear when projects like that are happening, because it makes our landscape scale work in some ways just seem even more relevant because it provides little stepping stones of biodiversity. So it's always very pleasing for me to know people are doing it.
So we have a question in that the generating fields is that they will naturally progress from grassland to forest. And they're asking, do you remove trees from the grassland you own?
Oh, good question. So again, through our conservation planning approach, we try to work out whether a certain area would be best restored as grassland or restored as forest. And that that initial decision goes into what seed mix we use. So if we're like, oh, this needs to be a grassland, then we wouldn't be planting very much in the way of trees and shrubs for the most part. And we would set up a regular prescription to either burn that habitat as Indigenous people and as would have happened naturally, to try and keep it open as grassland habitat. And we do a lot of work like that, especially near Rice Lake in the Rice Lake Plains natural area. We use prescribed burning as a tool to maintain grassland. Some cases, if that tool isn't available to us for whatever reason, and we are trying to promote grassland habitat, then we may well go in and actually selectively remove some trees and shrubs. But we're doing that very carefully and thinking really hard about what are the best, or what is the most likely biodiversity outcomes that we can really conserve at this place. Is this actually going to be a big enough patch that will really support grassland birds like bobolinks, for example? In which case, then we would do our best to burn or to remove trees. But if it's actually somewhere that would be more likely to support Acadian flycatchers, if we let it succeed to forest, then we'll encourage it to forest. And I appreciate there's other habitat factors that go into it, but at the broadest sense, we'll essentially look at how big is that patch of habitat and what ecosystem is best suited for it.
And someone is asking, are there any projects planned in the Niagara region?
Good question. So we have a couple of properties in the Niagara region. We have a property called the Lathrop property, which is actually in the village of Fonthill. And it's a lovely patch of quite hilly forest. It protects the headwaters of 12 Mile Creek. And there's some restoration work that has been happening on and off over the years. And there's some little pockets of grassland that it was non-native grassland kind of surrounded by forest that we've restored. There's also some work to try to restore the connectivity of some of the river systems in there. That's going to involve a bit of an engineering project to kind of reconnect things and reroute trails and things like that. So that's a neat project that you can visit. There's a trail network in there. Yeah.
And now back to the contiguous areas where someone is asking, can homeowners with backyards create contiguous neighborhoods in urban areas? Could you do that with enough size?
That's a great question. So I'll take my own garden as an example. So I have an urban backyard here in London, and I've jammed a whole bunch of native plants in it. I've got somewhere in the region of 200 species of native plants. And a bunch of those plants have hopped the fence into my neighbour's yard. And fortunately, I have a very understanding neighbour. And there was once, I tell the story a lot, there was a New England aster, which is this lovely deep purple flowering, fairly common roadside aster native thing, and it was growing in her yard. And she came up to me one day and she said, oh, this plant, what is it? And I said, oh, I'm really sorry, it's one of my native plants that must have seeded itself in. I can remove it for you if you prefer. And she's like, no, I just wanted to know how to look after it because it's so pretty. So I've been really privileged that she's been really quite excited about my crazy garden and has actually been quite happy to let me kind of hop the fence as well and kind of nurture some of the plants a little bit. And I've tried to teach her some of the non-native plants and some of the invasive plants that have come in, and she's let me kind of manage things a little bit, which is really cool to see. But it does absolutely mean that when I'm out listening for birds in the morning in my backyard, I'm increasingly hearing birds using her backyard because I know there's a whole bunch of food in there for them as well. There's things producing berries, there's seeds and things over there as well. So if you can get a bunch of people together and actually plan it a little bit less haphazardly than what's happened with me, then you can create some pretty significant patches of habitat. And I think that's a really neat thing to do. It'd be a really neat way to bring communities together. and get some pretty significant habitat patches going within the obvious constraints of what you can ever really achieve in an urban area. But if you're thinking about insects and birds especially, then you can make quite a difference in those areas. Yeah.
So there was a question about invasive management, and they're asking, do you try to remove the invasives first, or do you try to outcompete the invasives with natives?
Yeah, good question. A little bit of both, ultimately. When we're restoring an agricultural field, I appreciate how horrific this may sound, but one of the best situations to restore from is actually a field that's been used to grow Roundup-ready soybeans or corn. So that's a very common agricultural practice all around us in Southern Ontario, and some of our properties have a farm field on them. We will restore it immediately after the last harvest, because at that point it's generally very clean. There's very few weeds growing in that field. And if we can get in and jam in our native seed mix really quickly and let the seeds stratify over the winter, and then stuff, plants pop out of the ground like magic next spring, then that's often been quite a successful approach in our experience, because we're starting with quite a clean site and we're jamming in a lot of diversity. So lots of different plants that need slightly different things can be really good cumulatively at outcompeting natives or invasives. In a situation that's already kind of invaded with non-native plants, then we will do our best to remove stuff. So even in an agricultural field, we'll kind of check the edges and kind of get invasive species out as much as we can before we do the restoration. But it does really speak to the importance of our long-term stewardship and our long-term conservation planning that supports that stewardship, is that we have people going back and checking and dealing with invasives that inevitably do make their way in despite our best efforts. It is an ongoing battle in some places.
We're asking, is it difficult to find affordable properties appropriate to your goals with a willing buyer, particularly in Southern Ontario?
That's a good question. It certainly can be. We've been incredibly lucky to work with some incredibly generous people who have been in a position to be able to donate land or donate the financial means to us to allow us to buy land. But it certainly is a challenge. Land prices are not going down anytime soon, it seems, and it does again mean that it is increasingly important for us to be as strategic as we possibly can, because there are no spare resources kicking around to not be as strategic as we can with biodiversity in mind. Yeah.
And there's a question, if you work with Rare Charitable Reserve, which is close to here and it has in Wellington County, has acquired 4 properties now. And I guess the other question, do you work with other conservation groups?
Absolutely, yeah. So we do work with Rare. We've had a relationship on and off over the years for many years. I know Steffi, the executive director, fairly well. And time passes and we don't have a whole lot to talk about, and then suddenly we'll find ourselves in the same meetings 3 days in a row or so. Absolutely. And right across the country, we work with other conservation organizations, other partners, non-conservation organizations as well, in as collaborative a way as we can to achieve outcomes for everybody. And sometimes that means it's a situation where there's some land that we really think should be protected, and sometimes we're just not quite in the best position to protect it ourselves, but by us being at the table, we can bring resources to the table. We can bring, for example, GIS expertise, we can bring conservation planning expertise, we can bring all sorts of things to the table to facilitate conservation that might be executed by other organizations. And we do our best to support our conservation partners in whatever way we can. Yeah.
Thank you. And here's a very practical question. Do you primarily plant trees from seed, or do you plant bare root or potted stock?
Good question. A little bit of both. It depends on the situation. On Peely Island, the example I had, we mostly planted from seed, just because out there, there was very little in the way of native plant. There is a gentleman out there that does grow some native trees and shrubs that were able to purchase for some of that. But the scale of some of our work meant that most of what we did was by seed, and we kind of planted some seedlings here and there to kind of augment that. It tends to be, it's obviously more expensive to plant trees only, and arguably trees are a little bit riskier. They're slightly more expensive and slightly more at risk from not making it. So we'll often do a mixture. We'll get the bulk of our density in by seed, but then we'll plant in some seedlings, either in strategic areas where we really want to speed the process up a little bit, or it might be certain species that it's hard to get the seeds of, but it's easier to get either bare root or potted stock for. So it varies, and it depends on, sometimes there's opportunities, sometimes there's, again, a conservation partner that has access to a whole bunch of trees, and we have a bunch of land that needs a bunch of trees on them. So it varies, depends on the situation.
Do you grow anything yourself, or do you contract with growers? Like, are you
Good question.
growing up and seeding your own plugs?
We're starting to grow a little bit of stuff ourselves, actually. We're starting to establish some seed orchards, as we call them, on some of our properties. And that's really essentially a mixture of plants that we'll plant, and then we'll harvest the seeds from them for use in other restoration projects. So that's something that we're starting to get off the ground, again, particularly in Rice Lake Plains, where we have a few seed orchards just starting there. I don't think we currently grow actual plant stock. That starts getting complicated and needs things like greenhouses and buildings and structures and things like that. And we haven't quite gone down that line just yet. But there are a number of native plant nurseries that we do support by purchasing planting stock, just depending on where we're working.
And are your growing partners, are they sourcing and collecting seed from your properties as well?
There is a bit of that. Some seeds are collected from our properties, or they're collected from adjacent natural areas, or in the case of longer established nurseries, then they have their own kind of seed rows, and they harvest seeds themselves from their stock kind of year after year. So again, it's a big mixture, and like sourcing seed for native planting, especially at the scale that we're trying to really ramp up to, it is a bit of a constraint, is getting enough seed stock, and it's something that various industry partners are kind of talking about. How do we kind of increase access to native plant resources so that both restoration and gardening can really happen at a bigger scale and more efficiently. So it's certainly something that I think we'll see big improvements in over the next few years.
Do you try to source local?
We do, for the most part. We'll source as locally as we can, generally speaking. The science on that is a little bit mixed. A lot of our work in Pelee Island, for example, we were fairly conservative and selected sources of seeds, mostly on our own NCC properties for our own restoration right there. It was partly logistical and practical reasons, but also being a little bit conservative of kind of finding stuff locally. It can sometimes run into the challenge of, well, do we want to restore it, or do we want the seeds to be super local? And sometimes we just can't do both. So we'll look for things slightly further afield. It's something that's interesting to think through when you think about the seed itself and how likely that is to move on the wind or be carried by migratory jays or something like that. But then also thinking about how far pollinators themselves might be moving genetic material around, then choosing super local seed sources may actually not always be entirely relevant when you've got animals moving pollen and seeds around at a bigger scale anyway. And then there's another train of thought, of course, where we're thinking about, well, should we be trying to kind of second guess the impacts of climate change on temperature regimes or moisture regimes on this particular place, and should we be looking for a place that is going to look like this and get seeds from an area where the plants have maybe already evolved to survive those conditions? And that starts getting very tricky because, of course, different things evolve to fill slightly different niches, and it can be a lot of guesswork rather than, and it's hard to always be super strategic with that. But trying to kind of consider a lot of these different angles as we choose seeds, and while also prioritizing actually getting seeds in the ground.
So I think I've come to the end of the questions, unless there's anybody has a last question that they want for Mhairi. Seeing lots of thanks for you, and it was certainly a very interesting presentation, and thank you very much. And I'm hoping you're feeling well. We had some illnesses on our end too. So in many ways, it worked better to have this come on Zoom. But
Great.
so thank you very much. If people want to contribute to the Nature Conservancy's work, I assume that you've got donation boxes on your website too.
Yeah, and if you're interested in learning more about our work or supporting our work, then please do look us up at natureconservancy.ca. Drop me an email. Actually, I can quickly share my screen again for my contact details. If you want to get a hold of me, or oops, go. If you want to get a hold of me, drop me an email or visit our website, and we're super interested to hear from you, and definitely welcome any support you're willing to give, whether it's financial or coming to a volunteer event sometime.
Well, thank you very much. I'll just remind people we did record this, and we'll, within a week or so, we should have it up on our YouTube channel. So thanks very much, Mhairi, and thank all of you for attending, and thanks for all of you who planned to attend in one place and ended up attending in another on really short notice. But we really appreciate your coming. So goodbye all. We'll see you hopefully at our various meetings in the rest of this month and next month.
Thanks so much.
Okay, bye-bye all.
Bye.